The walnut music box struck the wet cobblestones and broke into 3 pieces, and in the moment that followed, the small crank was still turning, releasing 3 warped notes into the drizzle beneath the overpass, slowing, then stopping altogether, leaving behind a silence that no one in that parking lot dared to fill. Delaney Shaw knelt on the stone, with both arms wrapped around the shoulders of an old man she had known for 3 weeks. She weighed 115 pounds. She had never been in a fight in her life, and she understood perfectly well that she was not going to win one tonight. But she had put herself in the middle, and she chose to stay there. The first blow grazed her temple, and the sound that left her was not a cry, only breath forced out of a body that refused to let go. The old man beneath her did not resist. He did not call for help, did not raise a hand to shield his face, did not move back so much as an inch. He simply looked down at the 3 pieces of wood lying in his palm, turning them, fitting them together, then fitting them again and again, as though if he could only find the right order, everything in the world would put itself back the way it had been. The young man standing over him laughed, wiped his hands on his jeans, said something about a senile old man and his toy, and his 2 friends laughed along half a beat too late, the way people laugh when they are still trying to convince themselves that something is funny. The old man did not answer, and it was not out of fear. For 8 years, he had no longer been able to. In the Federal Hill neighborhood of Providence, people knew him only as the old man in seat 6 at the diner beneath the overpass, the one who folded napkins into perfect triangles on Thursday nights. But that night was not a Thursday, and not one person in that parking lot knew that in the inside pocket of his coat there was a laminated card with no name printed on it at all. Only a single line of writing and 1 phone number, a number beside which, for 8 straight years, a man had sat waiting every night inside a restaurant that had been closed for exactly that long. Before the sun came up, every road off that hill had been closed, and the strangest thing about that night was this: not a single door was broken, and not a single person was touched. If you believe that a person's worth does not disappear along with their memory, give this a like, share it, and subscribe to our channel to walk with us all the way to the end. Providence in late autumn was a city that gave up its warmth slowly and without complaint, and the fog came off the bay every evening, the way it had for 200 years, sliding up the cobblestone slopes of Federal Hill until the street lamps wore soft yellow collars, and the hills seemed to end somewhere just past the reach of the light. Down where Atwell's Avenue bent toward the river, the ground dropped away beneath a concrete overpass, and tucked into that hollow, like something the city had forgotten to finish, was a diner with a hand-painted sign and 11 stools along a counter that had been resurfaced twice since Margot Pomeroy bought the place. It stayed open all night. That was the whole business model. Everyone who worked a shift nobody else wanted eventually found their way down that ramp, and Delaney Shaw had been finding her way down it for 11 months. She came in through the back, past the dumpsters, past the loading door that never locked properly, and she hung her coat on the 3rd hook because the first 2 were broken. The staff room was not a room so much as a widening in the hallway, a bench, a mirror with a crack in the corner, a metal locker that had been painted over so many times the door no longer closed flush. She sat down on the bench and pulled the folded bills out of her apron and began to count. This was a ritual by now, and like most rituals, it had stopped being about the thing it was originally for. She made 3 stacks on her knee. The first was rent, and it went into an envelope. The second was gas, and it went into the pocket she never used for anything else. The third was food, and the 3rd stack was always the thinnest. And some nights it was not a stack at all, so much as a suggestion of one. 2 bills laid flat and smoothed down like she could iron more value into them. She did not think about it much anymore. She had gotten good at not thinking about it, the way a person gets good at walking on a leg that never healed right. Her phone buzzed against the bench beside her. She looked at the screen. It was a number she knew, an area code she did not, and she let it ring until it stopped, and then she watched the little icon appear that meant they had left a message again. $71,000. That was the figure, and it had not moved in a year and a half, and it belonged to a father who had been dead since March. She put the phone face down. Out front, Margot was arguing with the coffee machine. She was 63 years old, and built like someone who had spent 4 decades carrying trays, and she called everyone honey, including men who had been coming in since before Delaney was born. She looked up when Delaney came through the swinging door and tipped her chin at the ceiling in the corner above the register, where a small black camera hung at an angle it had not been installed at. "It's still doing it," Margot said. Doing what? Nothing, Margot said. It's doing nothing. It's been doing nothing since July. I called the man. The man wants 400 to come look at it. And then he wants more to fix whatever he finds. And I told him what I could do instead is keep the sign on and pray. Delaney tied her apron and said nothing. Because there was nothing to say that Margot did not already know. The camera stayed where it was, pointing at a stretch of counter, seeing nothing, recording nothing. A small dead eye above the register. On her left wrist, Delaney wore a man's watch, too large for her, the leather band punched with an extra hole to make it fit. It had not run in a long time. Customers noticed it sometimes, and when they asked what time it said, she would pull her sleeve down over it and tell them the clock on the wall worked fine. She never told anyone where the hands had stopped. She had never once thought about setting it again. Then the bell over the door went, and the first of the night came down out of the fog, and the shift began. On Thursdays, the bell over the door went at the same point in the night, late enough that the truckers had cleared out, and early enough that the hospital shift had not yet come down, and Delaney had learned to hear it without looking up. The old man came in the way he always came in, unhurried, taking the ramp one step at a time with one hand on the rail, wearing a gray wool coat buttoned all the way to the throat, even on nights that did not call for it. He did not look around the room. He did not need to. He went down the counter past the empty stools and stopped at seat 6 and sat. And he set a small walnut box on the laminate in front of him, squaring it with the edge. And only then did he let go of it. Margot was already pouring. He raised one finger and moved it a few inches toward the pie case, and she said, "The coconut cream is fresh. Sal, I made it this morning." And she had the plate down before his hand had finished the gesture. He nodded once. Then he reached for the napkin dispenser. He pulled one out and laid it flat and pressed the crease with his thumbnail, corner to corner, and folded it into a triangle so exact that the edges disappeared into one another, and he set it down and reached for another. He did this the way other men read a newspaper. Delaney had watched him do it 4 Thursdays running now, and she had never once seen him fold one badly. When she came down the counter with the pot, he lifted his cup an inch off the saucer, without being asked, and she filled it, and he set it down, and he looked at her. "Has my son come in yet?" he said. He asked it every Thursday. He had asked it the first night she ever served him, and he had asked it the second Thursday as though the first had never happened. And by the third, she had understood what she was dealing with, and had stopped feeling the small cold drop in her stomach that came with hearing a question for the second time. She had spent 4 years learning what to do with a question like that. You did not say, "We talked about this." You did not say, "Don't you remember?" You did not put a hand on a man's arm and lower your voice and explain to him, gently, kindly, patiently, that he was wrong, because there was no version of that sentence that did not take something from him, and he had already had enough taken. So she did what she had learned to do. She took a clean cup down off the shelf behind her and set it on a saucer and put it on the counter in front of the empty stool beside him, seat 7, and she filled it, and she left the little steel pitcher of cream next to it. "Not yet," she said, "but I've got his coffee poured." The old man looked at the cup for a moment. Then his shoulders came down half an inch, the way a man settles when he has been told something he was hoping to hear. And he nodded, and he reached for another napkin. She moved on down the counter. When she came back around 20 minutes later, the coffee in seat 7 had gone cool and untouched, and she took it away and poured it out and washed the cup and put it back on the shelf, and neither of them said anything about it. He left before the hospital shift came down, the way he always did. Delaney cleared seat 6, stacked the plate, wiped the crumbs into her palm, and carried the ticket to the register. Margot reached over and put her hand flat on top of it before Delaney could ring anything. "Not that one, honey." She looked up. "Somebody covered it," Margot said. "Covered what?" "All of it. That seat. Paid a year out, in advance, in one go." Delaney stood there with the ticket still under Margot's hand. "Who did?" Margot picked up her rag and turned toward the pass-through and started wiping down a stretch of counter that Delaney had already wiped down twice that night, working the cloth in slow circles, and she did not answer. She did not change the subject either. She simply stopped talking, the way a door stops in its frame. And after a moment, Delaney let go of the ticket and walked back to the floor. Later, near the end of the shift, she was out on the ramp with a bag for the dumpster, and she looked up at the street through the fog and stopped. There was a car parked on the far side, dark, 4 doors. Nothing about it worth noticing, sitting under a lamp with its engine off. It was not the first time she had seen it. She stood there with the bag in her hand and understood. the way a person understands something they have been looking at for weeks, that she had seen it on every Thursday she had worked, always in the same place, always with no one getting out. She waited. Nobody got out. Then, after the old man's shape had gone up the hill and turned the corner and disappeared, the headlights came on and the car pulled away from the curb and drove off in the other direction. The following Thursday it rained hard enough that the water came down the ramp in a sheet and pooled against the door, and the old man came in soaked through, his coat black with it, his hair flattened to his skull, and he stopped 3 steps inside, and stood there, and did not go to seat 6. Delaney saw it happen before Margot did. She saw his hand come up and touch the counter, and then come off it again, and she saw his eyes go around the room once, twice, faster the second time, not looking at anything, only moving, and she saw his mouth start working without sound. He turned toward the door he had just come through, and then turned back. "This isn't," he said. "This isn't." He could not get the rest of it out. He pressed the heel of his hand against his forehead and pushed, hard, as though the thing he needed were behind the bone, and he could work it loose. His breathing had gone short and high up in his chest. Margot started around the end of the counter with her hands already out, and Delaney said her name, quietly, and Margot stopped. Delaney did not go toward him fast. She did not reach for his arm. She had seen what happened when you took hold of a man in that state, how the touch became one more thing coming at him from a direction he could not track, and she had learned the hard way in a kitchen in Cranston, with her father backed against the refrigerator, that the fastest way to make it worse was to try to make it better. So she came around slow and stopped an arm's length short of him, and lowered herself until she was crouched, her knees bent, her face below his, looking up. She did not tell him where he was. She did not tell him it was all right. She looked at the box in his hand, the walnut one, the one he set on the counter every week, and squared with the edge before he let go of it. And she said, in an ordinary voice, the voice of a woman making conversation across a counter, "That's a beautiful thing you carry. Does it still play?" He looked down at it. His breathing did not slow yet, but his eyes came to rest, and that was the first thing. Then, because his hands knew what to do even when nothing else did, his thumb found the little crank on the side, and he turned it, and turned it again, and the tune came up out of the wood into the noise of the rain, slow and thin and a little flat in the middle where a tooth had worn down. Delaney stayed where she was, crouched, not touching him, letting it play. He did not get to the end of it. Somewhere before the tune came back around to where it had started, his shoulders came down, and his breathing dropped into his belly, and he looked at her. Actually looked at her. And he said, in the flat, courteous way of a man who has arrived at a place and does not intend to trouble anyone, "Cold out there." "It sure is," she said. "Come sit down." She got his coat off him at the counter and carried it back to hang on the third hook, and it was heavier than it should have been, the wool holding what felt like a gallon of the night in it. She turned it to hang it straight, and the inside pocket gaped, and a card slid halfway out, laminated, softened at the corners from years of being carried. She caught it before it fell. There was no name on it. No last name, no first, no address, no next of kin. Just one line of type, worn where a thumb had passed over it too many times, saying that the man carrying this card had trouble remembering, and asking whoever found him not to leave him alone, and beneath that a telephone number. That was all. She stood in the hallway with it in her hand and looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked back through the pass-through, at seat 6, where he was sitting with his hands flat on the laminate, calm now, waiting for coffee he had not asked for yet. She put the card back into the pocket and pressed the flap down over it. He was all right. There would be time. Roger Williams Park on a Saturday in the first week of November held the last good sun of the year, and it came down through the bare branches onto the walk beside the pond and lay there in long, warm stripes. Delaney found Sal on the third bench from the boathouse, sitting the way he sat at the counter, coat buttoned, hands on his knees, the walnut box beside him on the slats. Margot had told her where he would be. "Every Saturday," she said. "Same bench, and his people bring him and pick him up. And honey, do not make a thing of it." So Delaney did not make a thing of it. She sat down on the far end of the bench with a paper sack of day-old rolls from the diner, and tore one in half, and handed him half without looking over. And he took it, and began breaking off pieces the size of a thumbnail, and setting them on the path in a neat line. And within a minute there were pigeons. There were children all along the water that afternoon, out with their parents, and the sound they made carried across the pond and came back off the boathouse wall, and Sal listened to it with his chin up. A woman came along the path with a canvas bag over one shoulder and a girl walking beside her, a box of crayons in the girl's hand, and a sheet of drawing paper held out flat in front of her, the way you carry something that is still wet. They stopped a few feet off. The mother said good afternoon, and Sal nodded, and the mother said she has been working on that one all morning, and she would like to show you. Sal did not get up. He did not reach. He simply turned a little on the bench and looked at the paper while the girl held it up, standing next to her mother, and it was the pond, unmistakably the pond, with a boathouse the color of a plum, and a great many pigeons drawn as small gray commas across the bottom, and one figure on a bench in a gray coat. Sal looked at it for a while, then he smiled, and it was a whole smile, the kind that changes the architecture of a face. And he said thank you, and he said it clearly. The mother said something to her daughter, and the girl laid the sheet down on the bench beside the walnut box, and the two of them went on toward the boathouse in the sun, and the laughter went with them. Sal put 2 fingers on the corner of the paper to keep it from lifting. Delaney sat with the sack in her lap and did not trust herself to say anything for a moment. She had come straight from home in her uniform, because her shift started at 6, and when she finally stood to go, the apron was still tied at her waist, and Sal looked up at her, and his eyes went to the small white tag pinned above the pocket, and he read it. "Delaney," he said. "Good." That was all he said. Hours later, in the middle of the dinner rush, she carried a crate of eggs into the walk-in and set it down, and stood in the cold with her hand still on the shelf, and she stayed there long enough that Margot called her name twice. 9 floors above the water on the east side of the harbor, there was a room that took up the whole top of a building nobody in Providence could have told you the owner of, and the man who used it kept no art on the walls. He kept a map. It ran the length of the long wall, the city drawn in fine gray line work, every block, every wharf, every lot, and across the face of it were small dots of ink, hundreds of them, made with the same pen over what must have been years, and if you stood back far enough, you could see that roughly 2/3 of the buildings on that map carried one. Elias Ferraro sat with his back to it. He was 34 years old and built like a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be understood, and he wore a charcoal coat with no tie, no ring, no watch, and he drank his coffee black out of a cup that did not match its saucer. Gideon Marsh stood at the window with his hands behind his back, 58, gray at the temples, the last man alive who still called him Kid when there was nobody else in the room. "The West End frontage is going to auction again in January," Gideon said. 4 parcels. The Vance people have been circling it for 2 years, and they are going to come in heavy this time, and if you want it, I would want to start moving now. Elias did not look up from the cup. "Bought it," he said. Gideon turned around. "When?" "Last month," quietly, through the trust. "It closed on a Tuesday." Gideon looked at him for a moment, and then laughed once, without much humor in it, and said, "Preston Vance has been telling half this city for 2 years that he has that block." "He does not have that block," Elias said. He turned the cup a quarter turn on the saucer. "There is a building on the corner of that run, 3 stories, and if anybody puts anything taller than that on the West End frontage, then from the top of the hill you cannot see down onto the roof of my father's restaurant anymore." Gideon said nothing. "That is the whole reason," Elias said. "There is no other reason. It is not an investment." Then the door opened, and 2 men brought in a third, and the third one walked in on his own, so it did not look like anything. His name was Halloran, and he had run a receiving crew on the North Wharf for 11 years, and he had been trimming off the top of it for the last 2, in amounts small enough that a lazier man would never have found them. He stood in front of the desk. Nobody offered him a chair. Elias set down the cup. He slid an envelope across the desk, and on top of the envelope he laid a single sheet of paper, and he turned them both so they faced the man. "There is a flight tomorrow afternoon out of Green," Elias said. "It is paid for. It goes one direction." Halloran looked at the envelope, and then at the paper. The paper was a list. It ran to the bottom of the page, and it was arranged by category, and it named the lease on his apartment, the lease on the yard he kept his truck in, 2 bank accounts, the account his daughter's tuition came out of, the union card, and every payroll on Federal Hill and the North Wharf, and the 2 blocks behind the market where his name had appeared as of yesterday afternoon. Beside each line, in the same fine hand that had made the dots on the map, was written the word "removed." "This was done yesterday," Elias said, "before you came in here." It is not a threat, and there is nothing on that page you can talk me out of, because none of it is in my hands anymore. Halloran said, very quietly, that he had a family here. I know, Elias said. That is why you are getting the envelope. Nobody moved toward him. Nobody stood between him and the door. He picked up the envelope and the paper, and his hands were not steady, and he went out the way he had come in, walking on his own, and the door closed behind him, without any particular sound. Gideon stayed at the window. That's a mean thing to do to a man, he said. It's a mercy, Elias said, and he picked the cup back up. He'll be alive in the morning. He just won't be here. On Thursday nights, Elias Ferraro left the harbor building alone and drove himself, which was the first thing about the night that anyone who worked for him found strange, and the second thing was the car. It was a dark four-door sedan, 15 years old, with a hairline crack running up one corner of the windshield, and 190,000 miles on it, and he could have replaced it any Thursday he chose, and never had. He came up the hill the same way every week, 2 blocks, no more, and he took the turn at the top and came down along the far side of the street above the overpass and put the car against the curb under the third lamp, and he shut the engine off. From there, the diner sat below and across, down in the hollow, its windows throwing yellow onto the wet blacktop of the lot. And if the fog was thin, you could see the whole length of the counter through the glass, all 11 stools, and the pass-through, and the register at the end. He never turned the radio on. He sat with both hands off the wheel and watched. He watched an old man in a gray wool coat come down the ramp with one hand on the rail and go past the empty seats to seat 6 and set a small box on the laminate and square it with the edge of the counter before letting go of it. He watched Margot Pomeroy pour before the man asked. He watched a hand come up and a finger move a few inches toward the pie case. He watched the man take a napkin from the dispenser and lay it flat and press the crease down with his thumb, and then take another, and build a small, neat stack of triangles at his elbow that nobody had asked for and nobody would use. He watched the girl who worked the counter come down with the pot. And he watched the old man lift his cup an inch off the saucer without being asked. And he watched something pass between them that lasted no more than 4 or 5 seconds, and that he had no way of hearing through 2 panes of glass and 40 yards of fog. He watched her take a clean cup down and set it on the empty stool beside the old man and fill it and leave the cream. He did not move. The car got cold around him and he let it. He stayed until the old man stood and worked his arms back into the coat and came up the ramp and turned at the top of the hill. And only then did Elias reach forward and turn the key, and the headlights came on and swept once across the front of the diner, and he pulled away and drove down the other side of the hill, and he did not once, on any Thursday, in any weather, cross the street. He had a set of keys to that diner in his pocket. He had never used them. Margot had asked him one time, years ago, standing out on the ramp in the middle of a snowfall, with her arms crossed over her chest, whether he was ever going to come in, and he had said not tonight, and she had never asked him again. The following week she left the porch light on anyway. He never mentioned it. He simply came up the hill on Thursday and parked under the third lamp and sat, week after week, through 3 winters, the way another man might go to church. And the whole ritual had exactly one rule, which was that it happened on Thursdays. That Tuesday night, the bell over the diner door went at the wrong hour of the wrong day, and the space under the third lamp across the street was empty. Delaney heard the bell and knew before she turned around that something was wrong, because it was Tuesday. He came down the ramp the same as always, one hand on the rail, coat buttoned to the throat, and he went past the empty stools and sat at seat 6 and set the walnut box on the laminate and squared it with the edge, and he did all of it perfectly, and that was the part that put the cold hand on the back of her neck. Nothing about him was confused. The calendar in his head had simply come apart somewhere she could not see, and Tuesday had presented itself to him as Thursday, and he had put on his coat and walked down a hill that he knew, and come to a place where he belonged on a night when no one on earth was expecting him. Margot came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands, and stopped when she saw him and said, half to herself, "Oh, honey." Delaney was already pouring. She set the cup down and said, "Good to see you," and he lifted it, and she watched his hand, and it was steady. Then she went back along the counter to Margot and said, quietly, "Does anybody come for him?" Margot said they bring him Saturdays. "There is a number," Delaney said. "In his coat. There's a card." Margot's face changed, and she said, "Get it." And Delaney said not yet, because he was calm. And if she started going through his pockets in front of him, she would lose that, and once you lose it on a night like this, you do not get it back. Keep him here, Margot said. I'll call the police and have them run him home. Delaney said she would keep him here. She kept him there. She refilled the cup he had not finished, and she brought him a plate of the coconut cream without being asked, and she asked him if the box still played, and he turned the little crank and let out 4 notes of it, and he set it back down and reached for the napkin dispenser and started to fold, and by the time Margot had the phone in her hand, there were 7 triangles in a stack at his elbow. That was when the headlights came across the front window. The truck came off the street and down into the lot too fast. And it stopped at an angle across 2 spaces, and the bass in it was loud enough to move the water in the glasses along the counter. 3 of them came through the door. The one in front was young, expensively dressed, sunburned in November, and his name was Brody Vance, and his father owned a great deal of the ground between the diner and the water. The 2 behind him were laughing already at nothing. They took the far end of the counter and ordered coffee and did not drink it. And then the one in front turned on his stool and looked down the length of the counter at an old man in a gray coat folding napkins into triangles. "Hey," he said. "Hey, old-timer." Sal did not look up. He pressed a crease with his thumbnail and set the triangle on the stack. "That's a hell of a system you got there," Brody said, and one of his friends laughed. "You expecting company?" Sal took another napkin out of the dispenser. Delaney came down the counter and said, "We're closing the kitchen in a few minutes, boys. So if you want anything hot, it's now." Nobody looked at her. Brody was off his stool. "What is that?" he said. He had come along the counter, and he was standing over seat 6 now, looking down at the little walnut box. And he picked it up. It happened that fast. He turned it over in his hands and found the crank and gave it a turn, and the tune came up thin into the room, and he laughed at the sound it made. Sal stood. It was not fast, and it was not a lunge. It was a man of 71 getting up off a stool, with both hands on the counter, and the sound that came out of him was not a word. It was the first sound anyone in that room had heard him make that was not a word, and it went through Delaney like something dropped down a stairwell. "Give it back," she said. Her voice was flat and level, and it was the voice she had used in hospital corridors for 4 years. And it was the wrong voice for a boy like that, because it was not afraid. Brody looked at her and smiled and walked backward toward the door with the box held up out of reach. And he said, "Come get it then." And he shouldered the door open and went up the ramp into the drizzle, and his friends went after him, and Sal was already moving around the end of the counter after his box. And Delaney went after Sal because there was no version of that night where she let him go up that ramp alone. Margot shouted her name. Out in the lot, the rain had gone fine and slow, and the light from the windows lay across the wet blacktop in long yellow bars. And Brody stood in the middle of it, turning the little crank and grinning at the old man coming toward him with one hand out. And then he stopped grinning, and he let go of it. What went through her, down there on the wet stone with her arms locked and her face turned into the wool of his coat, was not fear, and it was not courage either, and she would think about that for a long time afterward. It was a kitchen in Cranston. It was a grocery store on Reservoir Avenue on a Sunday 2 years before her father died, when he had stood in the checkout line and could not work out what the girl at the register was asking him for, and the man behind them had started in, loudly, so that everyone in that line could hear, about people like this and about some of us having somewhere to be, and Delaney had stood there with her hand on the cart and had said nothing, not one word. She had gotten her father out to the car and she had driven home and she had never told anyone, and it had sat in her since like a stone swallowed whole. That was what was in her arms now. Not the old man from seat 6. Something older than him and heavier. A debt she had been carrying since a Sunday afternoon, and she understood in a distant way that she was going to pay all of it tonight, all at once, and she did not let go. That was when the card came out of his coat. It slid free of the inside pocket and went down flat onto the blacktop between them, face up in the light from the windows, and the one in the back saw it and bent and picked it up and turned it toward the light. Trip Sutherland read it out loud. He read the line about how the man carrying it had trouble remembering. He read the part asking whoever found him not to leave him alone. Then he stopped, because there was nothing else to read. No name, no address, no family, no next of kin, nothing at all after that except a telephone number. And he stood there holding it. Nobody moved. The rain came down fine and slow, and the 3 of them stood in the yellow light and looked at the card, and then at the old man on the ground. And what came into that silence was not what should have come into it. Delaney felt it arrive. She felt it the way you feel weather change. Miles Aldridge said, quietly, "He doesn't know who we are. He said it the way a person says a thing out loud to check whether it is true. Tripp did not answer. "He looks right at you," Miles said. "And tomorrow he's got nothing." Brody Vance came forward and took the card out of Tripp's hand and held it up and read it himself, all of it, taking his time, and then he crouched down. He was close enough that Delaney could hear him breathing. He did not touch either of them. He held the card out flat over the puddle spreading beside the curb, and he opened his fingers, and he let it fall, and it landed face down in the water and went under. "There," he said. "Now nobody's coming." He stood up and wiped his palms on his jeans, and one of them laughed, and it was thin, and it came out wrong, and none of the three of them was in a hurry anymore. And that, more than anything else that happened in that lot, was the thing Delaney would never be able to explain to anyone afterward. Then the door of the diner banged open at the top of the ramp, and Margot Pomeroy came out into the light with her phone pressed against her ear, and her voice going up the hill loud enough to reach the street, giving somebody the address, saying it twice. The truck doors opened. It came up out of the lot fast, and took the corner without stopping, and the sound of it went away up the hill, and left the drizzle and the yellow light, and the water moving in the gutter, and Margot came down the ramp barefoot, and knelt in the puddle and pulled the card up out of it, dripping, and turned it over in her hand. Margot held the wet card up under the light, and read the number off it, and dialed it with her thumb, and 8 blocks away and 160 feet up the hill, in a dining room that had been closed for 8 years, a telephone began to ring. It was a room with the chairs turned up onto the tables, 40 of them, legs in the air, and a fine gray dust lying over everything the way snow lies, unbroken across the bar, across the cash drawer, across the shelf where the wine glasses still hung in their racks, and in that whole still room there were only 2 things that had been touched in 8 years. One was a path worn through the dust from the side door to a booth in the back corner. The other was the lamp above that booth, which had never once been switched off, and which anyone driving past on Atwell's Avenue could see burning through the painted glass at any hour of any night, and which the neighborhood had long ago stopped asking about. There was a telephone on the wall beside that booth, an old one, cord and all, and a man was sitting under it. Elias Ferraro had not come there that night because he expected anything. He came every night. That was the arrangement he had made with himself 8 years ago, and he had never told a living soul about it. Not Gideon, not Margot, not the men who worked for him and would have laid down in traffic if he had asked. Thursdays he sat in the car on the hill first, and came here after. Every other night of the week he came straight here, and he sat in the booth in his father's dark restaurant, with the dust on everything and the one lamp on, and he did paperwork, or he did nothing, and he waited beside a telephone for a call that in 8 years had never come. 3 weeks. That was how long it had been since he had sat down across a table from his father and looked him in the face. 3 weeks. And every one of those nights he had been in that booth, and if that made any sense at all, he had long ago stopped trying to explain it to himself. The phone rang. He had it off the wall before the first ring finished. There was a woman's voice, older, breathing hard, saying an address he knew better than his own, saying it twice, saying there was an old man in her lot and a girl on the ground with him, and she needed whoever this was, and she needed them now. And then she said, "Honey, I don't know who you are. I've never known who you are, but this card is all he had on him." Elias was already standing. He said one sentence. He said, "Do not let anyone move either of them." And then he said, and this was the only thing in his voice that gave anything away, "Is he hurt?" Margot said not hurt. Then she said, and he heard her voice come apart on it, "But he isn't right, and the girl is not waking up." There was a reason the card had no name on it. Elias had made that card himself. He had sat in that booth with a laminating machine from an office supply store on Bald Hill Road, and he had printed one line and one telephone number and nothing else. No first name, no last name, no address, because the day the name Ferraro went into the pocket of a 71-year-old man who could not remember who he had spoken to that morning was the day that man stopped being an old man in a gray coat and became a way to reach his son. There were people in 3 states who would have paid a great deal to know where Salvatore Ferraro took his coffee on Thursday nights, so his son had erased himself from him. That was the price, and Elias had paid it every day for 8 years, and it had bought exactly one thing, which was that his father got to walk down a hill by himself and be nobody. Down in the lot, the drizzle had gone to nothing, and the water was still moving along the gutter, and the light from the windows lay across the wet blacktop, and Delaney Shaw was on her back on the stone, with her eyes closed and Margot's coat over her. Sal had gotten himself down onto the ground beside her. He had no words left for what had happened, and no way to ask anyone for help, and no idea at all how any of them had come to be there. He had her hand in both of his. He held on to it, and he said her name, and then he said it again, and he kept saying it, over and over into the quiet, the one new name he had learned in 8 years, because it was the only thing left in him that he was certain of. The first thing was a bakery. It sat halfway up the hill on the east side, and it had been dark since the middle of the evening, the way it was dark every night of the year. And then the front of it came on, the whole window, all at once. Nobody came outside. Nothing else happened. 30 seconds later, the barber 2 doors up came on, and the front room of a social club across from it, and a hardware store that had not opened its lights past 6 o'clock in 30 years, and then it stopped being one at a time. It went up the street the way a fuse burns, both sides at once, awning after awning, and inside 2 minutes the whole of that stretch of Atwell's Avenue was standing wide awake in the middle of the night, with every window lit, and the wet street underneath it turned the color of a lit room, and up on the corners men were walking out into the road and stopping traffic with their hands. Then the sound came. It came in under the light, low, and Margot felt it in the ramp through her bare feet before she heard it. A shudder that came up out of the ground and into the concrete of the overpass and stayed there, because the overpass took every engine on that hill and doubled it and threw it back down into the hollow. 2 became 4. 4 became more than anyone counted. Headlights came around the top of the ramp and swung down and filled the lot and kept coming until the cars were up on the sidewalk and along the curb in both directions and out onto the avenue behind them, and the diner windows were shaking in their frames, and the water standing on the blacktop was moving in fine rings that would not settle. The ambulance came in first. It came down the ramp clean and fast, without slowing at a single corner, because by the time it turned off the avenue, there was not one car in its way anywhere between the hospital and the hollow, and somebody had already dragged the sawhorses back from the mouth of the lot to widen it. 2 medics were out and on their knees beside Delaney before the doors had finished swinging. Elias Ferraro came through all of it walking. He did not run. He came down the ramp with his hands empty and his coat open, and men stepped out of his way without being asked, and he went first to the girl on the ground because the medics were still working, and he could see his father sitting up. He took the charcoal coat off his shoulders and laid it over her, tucking it down along her side where the rain had gotten to her, and he did not say anything to her, and she did not know he was there. Then he crouched. There were 3 pieces of walnut on the wet stone. He picked them up one at a time, the 2 large and the small one with the crank still fixed in it, and he turned each one over once, and he put them into the inside pocket of his suit jacket, over his chest, and buttoned the jacket. Only then did he go to his father, and get down on the blacktop beside him, and put a hand on the back of the gray coat, and say something too quietly for anyone else in that lot to hear. Sal did not let go of Delaney's hand. Gideon Marsh stood back until the medics had her on the board and moving, and then he came in close and said, "Lo, how do you want it handled?" Elias stood up. He looked out past the ambulance at the lot, and the ramp, and the sidewalks, at 60-some-odd men standing in the light with their hands at their sides, waiting. "Find them," he said. "Nobody touches them." Gideon said, "Kid, nobody touches them," Elias said again, and it was not louder. He walked up the ramp to where the men were, and he stopped on the 3rd step from the top, which put him about a head above them, and he waited until the last of the engines shut off, and the only sound left in the hollow was the ambulance idling behind him. He did not raise his voice. He said that 3 young men had come down into that lot on a Tuesday night and taken something out of the hands of an old man who could not tell them his own name. He said that a woman who had known that old man for 3 weeks, who was owed nothing by anybody, and who weighed about as much as a bag of feed, had put herself between him and them and had stayed there. He said that she was going to the hospital now, and that she had done in 10 seconds what most men in this city talked about doing their whole lives. He said find the truck. He said that when they found it, they would find the address, and they would call the number he was going to give them, and then they would stand outside and wait, and not one man in that street would put a hand on anyone. He said that the first man who did would answer to him personally, and he said that part in exactly the same tone as all the rest of it. Then he stopped talking. Nobody said anything back. After a moment, the engines started, one after another, and the cars began to peel off the hill into the side streets, and the light stayed on all the way up the avenue. The boat shed at Fox Point belonged to Preston Vance, the way a great many things along that water belonged to him, and his son had a key to it, and that was where they went. It was a long, corrugated building with a rolling door at one end and a concrete floor that had been poured in the 1960s and never sealed, and it held 9 hulls up on cradles under canvas, and it smelled of pine resin and marine paint and cold stone, a smell that got into the back of the throat and stayed there. They pulled the truck in and brought the door down and stood in the dark with the engine ticking. And for a while, nobody said anything at all. Then Trip Sutherland went off between 2 of the cradles and was sick in the corner. Miles Aldridge sat down on an overturned bucket with his phone in both hands. He had taken video. He had taken it without thinking, the way he took video of everything, 41 seconds of it. And he sat there in the dark with the screen lighting his face from underneath, and he deleted it. Then he opened the folder where deleted things go, and he deleted it again. Then he sat looking at the little spinning symbol in the corner of the screen, and the words underneath it, which said that his library was sinking, and had been sinking since he walked in and lost the signal, and would finish sinking whenever it found one, and he could not make that sentence mean anything other than what it meant. Brody Vance was walking, up the length of the shed and back, up and back, past the cradles, saying that nobody saw anything, that the old man could not pick a face out of a room if you gave him a week, that there was one waitress and a camera in a diner that had not worked in years, saying it the way people say things when the person they are trying to convince is themselves. He was still saying it when the light came. It came in first as a line along the bottom of the rolling door, thin and white, and then another line came up the seam on the left side, and then the gaps in the siding all down the long wall filled in one after another, until the inside of that shed was ruled with white bars from end to end. And the canvas over the hulls turned gray, and their 3 shadows went up the far wall and stood there. Miles said, very quietly, that there was somebody out there. Nobody knocked. That was the thing that none of them had any way to prepare for. No one shouted, no one called a name, no one came to the door and tried the handle. There was no sound at all except engines idling, dozens of them, and after a while even those went off, one by one, and then there was nothing outside but the light, holding perfectly still, and the water moving against the pilings under the floor. Trip came out from between the cradles and sat down on the concrete with his back against a hull. "How long?" he said. Nobody answered him. It went on. It went on past the point where the cold came up out of the floor and into them, past the point where Brody stopped walking and sat down too, past the point where anyone had anything left to say about waitresses or cameras, and every so often one of them would look at the door, and the light would still be there, exactly as it had been, and that was somehow the worst part. That nothing was happening, and nothing kept happening, hour after hour, until the 3 of them had stopped waiting for something to come through that door, and had begun, without any of them saying it out loud, to want it to. Elias stood at the front of it, with his hands in his pockets, and the shed 30 yards off, and every light in that yard aimed at one rolling door, and Gideon Marsh came and stood beside him, and did not say anything for a long while. Then he said, "We can be done with this in 20 minutes, and there will be no argument anywhere in this city about whether it was fair." Elias did not answer. "Preston Vance has spent 11 years buying his way past every consequence that ever came for that boy," Gideon said. 3 arrests. 3. Not one of them ever reached a courtroom. You put this in front of a judge, and you will be standing in a hallway in 18 months, listening to a lawyer explain that it was a misunderstanding between young people who had been drinking, and that boy will walk out into the sunshine and go to lunch. He looked at the side of Elias's face. "There is another way, and you know exactly what it is. And every man standing in this yard tonight is waiting for you to say it. And not one of them would ever speak about it again as long as they lived. Your father built something in this neighborhood. This is what it was for." Elias said, quietly, that his father had built a restaurant. "That is not what I mean, and you know it," Gideon said. "I know what you mean," Elias said. He kept looking at the door. "It was," Gideon would say afterward, "the closest he ever came in 8 years to getting an answer he wanted, and he was still standing there, waiting for it, when a car came down the access road behind them and stopped, and Margot Pomeroy got out of it. She had put shoes on, and she was still wearing the apron she had been wearing at the diner, and she came across that lot through all those headlights, past 60 men who parted for her without knowing who she was, and she stopped in front of Elias Ferraro and held out her hand with something in it. It was a paper napkin. It was folded once, corner to corner, and pressed down along the crease with a thumbnail, and then folded a second time, and stopped halfway, unfinished. the last fold never made, and it was damp and grayed where it had been held. They took it out of her hand, Margot said. In the ambulance. She had it the whole time, and they had to work her fingers open to get the board strap across her, and one of them put it in my hand, and I have been carrying it since. Elias looked at it. She said something before she went under, Margot said. I want you to have it exactly the way she said it, because I have been turning it over the whole ride down here, and it is not what I expected, and it is not what you are expecting either. Go on, Elias said. She said, don't let him see any of this. Margot's voice went flat and careful, the way people speak when they have decided not to fall apart in front of a stranger. Not don't let them get away with it. Not find them. Not one word about those boys. Not one. And honey, she had every right. She was lying in my parking lot, and what she was worried about was that an old man was standing 4 feet away, watching it happen, and that he was going to carry the feeling of it around with him tomorrow, without any idea where it came from. She was working. That is all that was. She was still on shift. Nobody in that yard said anything. Elias took the napkin out of her hand. He held it for a moment, that small, damp, unfinished triangle, and then he put it into the inside pocket of his jacket, where the 3 pieces of walnut were, and buttoned the jacket over both. He took his phone out. Gideon said his name once. Elias dialed a number he had never dialed in his life, and it rang 3 times, and a man answered it in the voice of somebody who had been asleep. And Elias said, Detective Hollis, this is Elias Ferraro. There was a silence on that line long enough that Margot heard it from where she was standing. Then Elias gave him the address of a boat shed at Fox Point and told him there were 3 young men inside it, and that no one had gone in and no one was going to. And he said the door was not locked from the outside and had never been locked from the outside, and that they could come out any time they wanted to, and nobody would stop them. Then he hung up, and he stood there, and the yard stayed exactly as it was. It was a long time before anything moved. Then the rolling door came up from the inside, a foot, then higher, and 3 young men walked out into all that light on their own, with their hands out where everyone could see them, and not one man in that yard took a single step forward. She surfaced into a white room with a bar across her ribs where the breathing was, and the first thing she was aware of was her own left wrist lying on the blanket with her father's watch still on it, too big for her, the leather punched with its extra hole. The hands stopped where they had been stopped for over a year. The second thing she was aware of was the old man asleep in the chair beside the bed. Sal had his chin down on his chest, and his hands folded in his lap, and somebody had put a blanket over his knees, and there were 2 paper cups on the tray table, and one of them had not been touched. Delaney lay there and looked at those 2 things, the dead watch on her arm and the sleeping man in the chair, and something in her went very quiet. A nurse came and went. Then the door opened again, and a man she had never seen before came in and stood at the end of the bed, with his coat over his arm. And she knew who he was inside of 2 seconds, because Margot had come in at some point during the night and told her, and because he had his father's hands. You're the car, she said. Her voice came out wrecked. Across the street, under the 3rd lamp, every Thursday. He said yes. I've been serving him for 4 weeks, she said. Every Thursday he asks me the same question. He asks me if his son has come in yet. Elias did not say anything, and every Thursday I tell him not yet, and I pour a cup of coffee, and I put it on the empty stool next to him, so he has something to look at while he waits, and then 20 minutes later I go back and I pick it up and I pour it down the sink. Her breath caught on the ribs, and she waited it out and went on. He is sitting in there folding napkins for people who are not coming, and you are 40 yards away in a car with the engine off. She was crying by then, and it was not the kind of crying that softens anything. What is wrong with you? He set the coat on the back of the chair. He came around and sat down, not close, in the plastic chair on the other side of the bed, and he put his forearms on his knees and looked at the floor, and he let her say all of it. He did not tell her that she did not understand. He did not tell her that there was a lamp burning 8 blocks away, and a telephone on a wall and a booth in the dust where he had spent every night for 8 years. He had 3 weeks to account for, and she was entitled to ask about them, and so he sat there in a hospital chair and took it from a waitress with 2 cracked ribs. And when she finally stopped, he said, "You are right," and that was all he said. Out in the hallway, later, Margot was sitting on a bench by the window with her hands around a cup of coffee, and Elias came and stood in front of her and asked her the question he had not been able to put down since he crouched on that wet blacktop. "She has known him for 3 weeks," he said. She does not know his name. Why would a person do that? Margot looked up at him. Sit down, honey, she said. I worked in your father's dining room for 20 years. I started at 19 years old carrying bread, and I finished as his floor manager. And he loaned me the money for my place out of his own pocket, and never once asked me for $1 of it back. And there is something I have not said to a living soul in 8 years, and I am going to say it to you now. And then I am going to drink this coffee. There were 2 men in that dining room on a Thursday in October, and it went bad between them fast, right there between the tables, and there were 60 people eating. Your father came out of the kitchen. He put himself between them. That is all he did. He did not swing at anybody, and he did not shout. He just stood in the middle of it, and he would not move. And they told him to get out of the way, and he did not get out of the way, and he stayed there until it stopped. And it stopped because he was standing there. Margot turned the cup in her hands. He walked out of that room, she said. He drove himself home. It was 3 days before anybody understood that anything had happened to him at all. And by then, it was already happening. And it did not stop happening. And it took him the rest of that year. Elias did not move. So you asked me why a girl who owes him nothing would get down on the ground and put her arms around a stranger, Margot said. I have been sitting here half the night in this hallway asking myself the same thing. And honey, I am 50 feet from the room where that man is asleep in a chair. And I have already asked it once before, 8 years ago, about him. He came back the next afternoon with a folder and did not open it. And he sat in the same plastic chair and said that the hospital was handled. All of it. And then he said there was one other thing. And that he wanted to say it plainly, and then never bring it up again. He said he knew about the $71,000. He said it could be closed out by Friday, the whole balance, cleanly and legally, and that no one would ever contact her about it again for the rest of her life. Delaney looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she said no. He said, May I ask why? Because then it has a price, she said. Right now what happened in that lot doesn't have one. It is the only thing I have ever done in my life that doesn't. And the minute you write a check for my father's medical bills, then every time I think about that night, I am also going to be thinking about the number, and I would rather owe $71,000 for the rest of my life than have to do that. She turned her head and looked at him. Don't buy it off me, she said. He closed the folder. He said all right, and he did not argue, and he did not come back to it, and 4 days later, she went home to the room she rented by the week on Broad Street, and slept for 11 hours, and woke up and noticed that her phone had not rung. It did not ring the next day either. On the 3rd day, she called the number that had been calling her for a year and a half, and gave them the account, and waited while a woman typed, and the woman came back on and said that the account was closed, and showed a 0 balance, and had been assigned out of their office. Delaney said assigned to who? The woman said she was not able to see that. Delaney sat on the edge of her bed, and called the state office that keeps the registrations, and she gave them the name of the collection company, and they gave her the name of the holding company that had bought its portfolio in the spring, and she wrote that name on the back of an envelope, and she called again and gave them that one, and they gave her another, and she wrote that under it. She did that 4 times. She was not a person who knew how to do any of this. She had worked in a nursing home, and then a printing plant, and then a diner, and what she had instead of expertise was 3 years of sitting on hold with billing departments, while her father slept in the next room. And it turned out that was enough. The 5th name on the back of that envelope was a trust with an address on the east side of the harbor, 9 floors up. She sat with the envelope in her hand for a long time. He had not known. She understood that immediately, and she went on understanding it, and it did not help. It had not been a decision, it had not been a gift, and it had not been a punishment. It had been one line in a portfolio somebody bought in a lot along with 60 other lines, a few thousand names in a spreadsheet in an office where nobody would ever read one of them, and one of those names was hers. And the reason she had been living in a room by the week and counting a stack of bills that was never a stack was that a company he owned had been calling her every day for a year and a half. When she went to see him, she did not sit down. She put the envelope on the desk, with the 5 names written down the back of it, in her own handwriting, and she watched him read it, and she watched him understand it, and she watched him not once try to tell her it was more complicated than it looked. That thing that took your father, she said. It has a name, and it has an address, and it is 9 floors up over the harbor, and you are sitting in it. She was very calm. It took mine too. It just did it slower, and it did it with a telephone. and I have spent 4 days trying to find a way to hold those two things in my hands at the same time. And I can't do it. And I don't know if I ever will." Then she picked the envelope back up, because it was hers, and she walked out. He did not follow her. He sat in that room with the map on the wall behind him, and he did not move for a long time. It did not fall apart. That was the thing nobody could quite make sense of afterward. Because there was a woman with 2 cracked ribs, and a 71-year-old man, and an owner who had watched part of it through her own front window, and none of that went anywhere. It simply got smaller. It got smaller by inches over 5 weeks, in a way that no one person was responsible for. The camera above the register had not recorded anything since July, and Margot said so under oath because it was true, and the defense thanked her for her honesty. There was a camera on the pole at the top of the ramp that belonged to the city, and it covered the mouth of the lot and the first 2 spaces and nothing else. And the back half of that lot, where all of it happened, had never been inside the frame of any camera in the history of Providence. Tripp Sutherland gave a statement in November that was detailed and terrible for everyone involved, and in January he gave a second one, in which he had thought about it more carefully, and now recalled that everyone had been drinking, and that there had been shoving on both sides, and that he could not honestly say who had made contact with whom, and he had a lawyer sitting beside him for the second one who had not been there for the first. Miles Aldridge produced his phone, and produced the cloud account behind it, and the file was there in the index, 41 seconds, and it would not open. 3 separate people tried. The county's technician wrote in his report that the file was present, but incomplete, and that partial recovery was not possible with the tools available to his office. Then in February, the district attorney's office offered a plea, and the offer was misdemeanor disorderly conduct and simple assault, and it carried a fine, and 200 hours of community service, and a provision that the whole thing would come off the record after a year of good behavior. And when Delaney sat in a conference room downtown and asked why, a young assistant district attorney with a good face and no room to move told her what the defense had already put on paper, which was this: that Miss Shaw had been carrying a debt of $71,000, a matter of public record, that the debt had been extinguished in December, that the entity which had extinguished it traced back, through 4 intermediate holdings, to a trust controlled by Elias Ferraro, that Miss Shaw had thereafter accepted a position and was drawing a salary from a foundation registered at an address owned by the same trust, that there was no allegation of wrongdoing on her part, that there did not need to be. The sentence they had written was that Miss Shaw is not a witness in this matter so much as an expense in it, and they had put it in the filing in exactly those words, and any competent attorney would put it in front of a jury on the first afternoon, and after that it would not matter what she had done in that parking lot or why, because 12 people would spend the rest of the trial doing arithmetic. Delaney sat in that conference room and read the sentence twice. She had refused the money. She had sat in a hospital bed with her ribs taped and told him not to buy it off her. And she had walked out of an office on the 9th floor with an envelope in her hand over exactly this, and none of that existed anywhere. What existed was a closed account with a 0 balance that she had never asked for, and it was going to be used to explain to a courtroom that the only clean thing she had ever done in her life had been paid for in advance. She got a cup of water out of the cooler in the hallway afterward and drank it standing up, and she did not say anything to anybody, and she went to work that night. Preston Vance came out of the Licht Judicial Complex on a bright cold morning in March, with his coat over his arm, and his lawyer half a step behind him, and he stopped at the top of the steps to fix his cuff, and he was in an excellent mood. There were reporters at the bottom, and he had already decided not to speak to them. He came down 4 steps, and saw Elias Ferraro sitting on the low granite wall along the side of the stairs with his ankles crossed, alone, no car in sight, and he stopped, and then he smiled, because he could not help himself. He said the thing men say when they think a room has been called in their favor. He said it was a shame, all of it, and then he said that in his opinion, the whole business should never have gotten as far as it did over a senile old man and a broken toy. He said it in a friendly voice, then he waited. Elias did not stand up, and he did not raise his voice. He said, "Sit down for a minute, Preston." And Preston Vance, for reasons he would never be able to reconstruct afterward, sat down on the granite wall. Elias took a folded sheet of paper out of his inside pocket and did not hand it over. He read from it the way a man reads a list he has known by heart for months. He said that the construction loan on the Point Street parcel and the 2 revolving lines behind it had been sold by the bank in October, in a package, to a fund out of Boston, and that the fund had been acquired in January. He said the name of the entity that had acquired it. He said that the general contractor Preston had used on every project he had put up since 2009 had signed an exclusivity agreement in December and would not be bidding his work in the spring. He said that the 2 seats on the Harbor District Planning Commission that had been reliably friendly to him for 11 years had come up for reappointment in February. He said the names of the 2 people who now held them. He said that the 3 long-term leases that carried Preston's whole East Side portfolio, the ones that were not due to renew until the fall, contained a change of control clause on the landlord's side, and that the landlord had changed in November, and that none of the 3 would be renewed. He read all of it in the same flat voice he had used to order coffee, and it took about 90 seconds, and Preston Vance's face went through several things while he did it, and arrived somewhere still in gray. He said, quietly, that most of that was not possible. Elias folded the paper and put it away. "It is possible," he said, "because none of it happened this morning." He looked out at the traffic on the far side of the plaza. "I want to be clear about something," he said, "because you have known me a long time, and you are going to spend a great deal of the next year trying to work out what I did to you. Nothing is going to happen to you, or to your son, or to anybody who works for you, and if anything ever does, it will not have come from me, and I will help you find out who it did come from. I have not taken a single person away from you." He turned his head. "I took the ground," he said. "That is all I have ever done. I do not take people. I take what they are standing on, and then I let them go on standing there as long as they like." Preston said. "When?" Elias stood up and buttoned his coat. "All of it closed before the first hearing," he said. "Every piece, months ago." Preston looked up at him. "Then why are you here?" he said. "Because you were going to walk out of that building this morning believing you had won," Elias said. "And I wanted to be sitting here when you did it." Then he went down the steps past the reporters and got into a 15-year-old sedan, parked at a meter and drove away, and Preston Vance sat on the granite wall in the sun for a long time, with his coat across his knees, and his lawyer stood 4 feet away and did not say anything at all. The storm came up the bay in the last week of March, and it came in fast, and by early evening the water was going sideways down the hill, and the drains at the bottom of the avenue had given up. At the day program on Sutton Street, a fire panel tripped, and both sets of doors released the way they are built to release, and for 11 minutes the front of that building stood open to the street, and Salvatore Ferraro walked out into it wearing a cardigan and no coat. They noticed inside of a quarter hour. After that, the phone started. Margot closed the diner in the middle of the dinner service, which she had not done in 19 years, and put the lights out and locked the door, and went up the hill on foot. The men from the social club came out. The bakery came out. Somebody found a stack of rain slickers in a storage room at the parish hall and handed them out on the sidewalk. By full dark, there were people along the seawall with flashlights, and people going through the underpass calling, and 2 men working the bus terminal downtown showing his picture at every window, and a line of headlights crawling the length of Wickenden Street at 15 miles an hour, with the windows down in the rain. The first place Elias went was his father's restaurant. He drove there before he drove anywhere else. He had the keys in his pocket, and he used them for the first time in 8 years, and stood in the doorway with the water running off him, and the chairs were up on the tables the way they had been, and the dust lay unbroken, and the lamp over the back booth was burning, and the room was empty. He locked it again, and went out. After that, he was on the water. He went down the length of the fish pier and out along the boat ramps at Fox Point with his shoes gone and the water over his ankles. And he went through the yards where the hulls sat on their cradles, and he was calling out a name that the man he was calling for had not answered to reliably in 8 years. And he did it for 2 hours. And men who had worked for him for a decade watched him do it, and did not know where to put their eyes. Delaney was on the seawall with a light when she stopped walking. She stood there in the rain and did not move for long enough that Margot came back for her and put a hand on her arm and said, "Honey, come on." And Delaney said, "We are all asking the wrong question." Margot said, "What?" She said, "Everyone out here is asking where he went." She turned around. "That is not the question. He is not lost. He knows exactly where he is going, and he is going there the way he has gone there for however long, and the only thing any of us needs to know is what day it is." Margot looked at her. "In his head," Delaney said. "Right now. Tonight. What day is it?" Margot stood in the rain with her hand still on Delaney's arm, and her face changed by degrees. "Sunday," she said. Delaney said, "Why?" "Because Sunday he closed," Margot said. 52 Sundays a year for 40 years. That room was dark and the sign was off, and he cooked for his own family in the back corner booth. And the only people in that building were his wife and his boy. And if you had walked in off that street on a Sunday looking for a table, he would have sat you down himself. She had both hands on Delaney's coat now. "Nobody has looked there," she said. "Elias looked there," Delaney said. "It was locked, and it was dark, and it was empty, and I heard him say so." Then she started running. They came up Atwell's with the rain still coming and Margot half a block behind her, and Delaney turned the corner and stopped in the middle of the street because the windows of the restaurant were lit, not the one lamp over the back booth. All of it. The chandeliers over the front room, the sconces down the long wall, the amber bulbs behind the bar, every light in that building burning out through the painted glass onto the wet sidewalk for the first time in 8 years, and from the street it looked like a place that was open for business and expecting people. The side door stood ajar with rain blowing in across the sill. Elias got there 4 minutes later. He came through that door with the water running off him and his shoes in his hand, and he stopped dead 2 steps inside. And Delaney was already standing in the middle of the dining room with her hand over her mouth. Somebody had been working in that room. The chairs were still up on the tables everywhere except the back corner. There, 4 of them had been taken down and set around the booth table, and the dust had been wiped off the wood in wide streaked arcs by the flat of a hand. 4 place settings had been laid out. Knife, fork, spoon, in the order they belonged, straightened, squared to the edge. 4 glasses had been carried up from the bar rack and set at the right of each plate. And beside each setting there was a paper napkin, folded once corner to corner and pressed down along the crease with a thumbnail, and folded again into a perfect triangle. 4 of them, all the same, all exact. Salvatore Ferraro was sitting at the head of the table with his hands flat on the wood, and his cardigan was soaked through, and he was waiting. Elias crossed that room slowly. He stood at the edge of the booth and looked at the table, and he counted, and Delaney watched him do it, watched his eyes go from one setting to the next, and she saw the moment he ran out. 3. His father, his mother, himself. 3. And there were 4. And he stood there in the light with his hands hanging and said, half to himself, in a voice that did not sound like the one he used anywhere else, "Who is the 4th one for?" And then he stopped. Delaney saw it come across his face. He put one hand on the back of a chair. "Oh," he said. He said it very quietly. She asked him what, and he did not answer her for a moment. And when he did, he was not looking at her. He was looking at the empty place at the far side of the table. He had a rule, he said, 40 years. He wouldn't let a table go out with 3 or 5, or however many were coming. He said every table sets one more than it needs. And Delaney said, "Why?" Elias said, "For whoever comes in with nobody waiting for them." Nobody in that room said anything. Somewhere out on the avenue a car went past slowly with its wipers going, and the rain came against the painted glass, and the 4 triangles sat in the light on the wiped wood. And Delaney Shaw stood in the middle of a dining room that had been closed for 8 years, and understood, all at once, and much too late, what she had been doing every Thursday night for a month. She had taken a clean cup down off a shelf, and set it on the stool beside an old man, and filled it, and left the cream. And she had done it because she could not think of anything else to say to a question she had no answer for. She had poured coffee for an empty seat, and poured it out again 20 minutes later. She had never once known that she was following a rule. She had never known there was a rule, and the man who had made it, 40 years ago, who could no longer hold on to his own son's face for the length of an afternoon, had been sitting 18 inches away from her the entire time. Elias went down onto one knee beside his father's chair. He put a hand on the wet cardigan sleeve and he said, "Dad." Sal turned his head. He looked at the man kneeling next to him, at the soaked shirt and the bare feet and the face, and he looked at him carefully and courteously and with real attention, the way a host looks at a stranger who has come in out of weather. There was nothing in it. Nothing came. Then he reached out and took hold of the empty chair on his left and pulled it back from the table a few inches, turning it out toward the room, and he moved his hand toward it, palm up, and he said, "Sit down. You are very welcome here." They got him into dry clothes, and Margot sat with him inside at the wiped table with her hand on his arm, and the rain thinned out to almost nothing, and Elias came out and sat down on the wet step under the awning with his forearms on his knees, and after a while Delaney came out and sat down beside him. Neither of them said anything for a long time. Then he said, 3 weeks. She waited. "I came up that hill every one of those Thursdays," he said. I put the car under the third lamp and I turned the engine off and I sat there and I watched him through the glass. And I watched you pour that cup and put it on the stool next to him. And then I drove home. 21 days. I never crossed the street once. Delaney looked out at the water running down the gutter. The last time I went in, he said. It was a Sunday afternoon, back at the program on Sutton Street. I brought him a bag of the almond cookies from the bakery on the corner because he used to keep a jar of them by the register and hand them to people's kids on the way out. And I sat down across from him and he looked at me and he was perfectly pleasant about it. And he said, "Are you the delivery man?" He said it kindly. Elias turned his hands over and looked at them. He said, "Are you the delivery man?" And then he said, "You can leave it in the kitchen." And he thanked me, and he went back to what he was doing. And I sat there and I said yes. That is what I said. I said yes, and I put the bag down, and I got up, and I walked out to the parking lot. And I got as far as the car. And then I could not. And I stood out there for a while, and then I drove away. And every Thursday after that I got as close as the far curb, and that was where it stopped. He was quiet. "I have not said that to anybody," he said. "There is nobody to say it to." Delaney did not tell him it was all right. She did not tell him that his father had not meant it, or that some part of him had known, because she had spent 4 years of her life listening to people say those things to her in kitchens and hallways and hospital corridors, and not one of them had ever helped. She sat there with the rain coming off the edge of the awning. "It isn't the forgetting," she said. "That's what nobody understands." He looked over at her. "You are not standing out in that parking lot because he forgot you," she said. "He doesn't feel a thing. He is in there right now, perfectly comfortable, and he has no idea that anything is missing. And that is the mercy of it. And it is the only one there is. You are out in the parking lot because you remember. You remember exactly what it was like to walk into that room and have him know you. And you are the only one left who does. And you have to carry that by yourself every single time you walk through the door. That is what it costs. And it does not get cheaper." He did not answer. She reached over and put her hand flat on the back of his, and left it there for a few seconds, and then took it away and put it back in her lap. Inside, through the glass, Margot was saying something to Sal and he was laughing at it. 9 days later, Preston Vance was admitted to Rhode Island Hospital after something that happened in the parking garage under his own office, and there were no witnesses to it, and nothing further about it was ever established. Elias heard at 11 in the morning. He went up to the 9th floor and stood in the room with the map behind him and waited. And Gideon Marsh came in and closed the door, and did not sit down and did not wait to be asked. "I am not going to stand here and lie to you," Gideon said. "So don't ask me a question you already know the answer to." Elias said. "Why?" "Because you would not," Gideon said. "Because that man sat on the steps of a courthouse in March and said what he said about your father with his lawyer standing right there, and you handed him a piece of paper. Because his son is going to do 200 hours of picking up trash on Allen's Avenue, and then a judge is going to wipe it off his record like it was a parking ticket, and the girl who put herself on the ground in that lot got called an expense in a public filing, and you sat there and let it be done that way. And I have watched you let it be done that way for 4 months. He put his hands out to the sides. "I have been doing it the other way for 30 years, he said. "It is the only thing I know how to do, and it has never once failed to work." Elias said, "You did it because you were angry." "No," Gideon said. "I did it because I love you, and I could not stand to watch it any more. That is the whole of it, and there is nothing underneath that." Elias called Ward Hollis that afternoon and asked him to come, and Hollis came, and sat down on the other side of the desk, and heard about 40 seconds of it before he stopped him. "Before you go on," Hollis said, "I want to be sure you understand what you are doing, because if you say the rest of that sentence out loud, I have to act on it. And Marsh has been at your side since before you were old enough to sign anything. He has been in every room you have been in. If we put him in front of a grand jury with a deal on the table, he does not go alone. You are putting yourself on that table, and everything under you, and every man who ever worked for your father." He looked at him. "Nobody would think less of you for calling me tomorrow and saying you thought about it." "Say the rest of it," Elias said. He said the rest of it. When it was done, Gideon came back up to the 9th floor because he had been asked to, and he stood in the same place he had stood that morning, and Elias told him what he had done. Gideon did not raise his voice. He did not argue, and he did not ask for anything. He stood there for a moment, and then he said, "Your father would have done exactly what you just did. He would have picked up that phone before I finished the sentence." And Elias said nothing. "And that," Gideon said, is why they put him in the middle of that dining room and took him apart. And it is why I have spent 8 years driving past that restaurant with the light on in the window, and it is why I did what I did in that garage, and I would do it again tonight. He looked at him a moment longer, at the boy he had taught to knot a tie. Then he put his hands out in front of him, wrists together, palms up, and waited for them to come in. Sentencing was set for the 2nd week of April, and 11 days before it, Delaney Shaw drove to a lot behind a marine supply store on Allens Avenue, where a work crew in orange vests was picking litter off the shoulder, and she waited by her car until the break, and then she walked over to a young man sitting on the guardrail with a bottle of water and sat down 4 feet from him. Miles Aldridge looked at her once, and then looked straight ahead at the traffic. She did not say anything about the parking lot. She said, "Your grandmother was Rosalie." He turned his head. "Rosalie Aldridge," she said. "Wednesday mornings, the 3rd booth from the door, the one under the window, and she took her eggs over easy, and she wanted the toast dry because she said everybody butters it too early and it goes soft." He did not say anything. "Margot kept a cup back for her," Delaney said. "There is a shelf behind the register with about 9 cups on it that do not go into the wash with the others, and every one of them belongs to somebody, and hers was the yellow one with the chip on the handle, and it sat on that shelf for 11 months after she died, before Margot could bring herself to put it in a box. That was before my time. Margot told me." He was looking at his hands. "I did not come here to make you into a good person," Delaney said. "I have no interest in that, and it is not my business. I came to ask you one thing, and then I will leave you alone. Do you remember what it feels like to be remembered by somebody?" He did not answer for a long time. Then he said, quietly, that he had watched it 11 times before he deleted it. He said that he had watched it in the shed while the light was coming through the walls, and that he had watched it in his car in his parents' driveway. He said that the file was still there in the account, and that the reason nobody could open it was that he had opened it and stripped part of it out himself with a program he found, and that he had kept the original in a second place because he had never quite been able to make himself throw it away, and that he had thought about that fact every single day for 5 months. He gave it to the district attorney's office on a Thursday. 41 seconds. The first 30 of it was what everybody had already agreed on, and what the plea had been written around. The last 11 seconds were not. In the last 11 seconds, the fight was over, and everyone was standing, and Brody Vance walked back into the frame from the left with his hands empty, crouched down, held something out flat over the water at the curb, and opened his fingers. It changed the word. It moved the whole thing out of the column where things happen, because young men have been drinking, and into the column where a person makes a decision after the moment has passed, and it did it on video, with a timestamp. The plea agreement was withdrawn 8 days before sentencing. Delaney did not tell Elias she had gone. He found out about it the way everybody else did, from the office, 4 days later. It opened in August, 4 months later, and it was not a restaurant. The sign in the window said Ferraro Center, and underneath that it said Adult Day Program, Memory Care, and it was open 5 days a week from 8 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon, and Delaney Shaw ran it. She had finished the certification she had walked away from 6 years earlier, sitting up nights at a table in the back with a textbook and a legal pad, and the state licensing inspector who came through in July wrote in his report that the intake procedures were the most thorough he had seen in a facility of that size. There were 12 tables in the main room. On each one, beside the water pitcher, there was a stack of unfolded paper napkins, and there was a reason for that, and nobody in the building ever mentioned it out loud, and nobody ever asked anyone to stop, and every table in that room was set with one more place than the number of people expected to sit at it. On Tuesday afternoons, a group came over from the middle school, 2 streets down with their teacher, and read out loud, one book to a table, and the sound they made filled that whole front room and came back off the tin ceiling, and there was a great deal of laughing, and on the wall by the window, framed, hung a drawing of the pond at Roger Williams Park, with a plum-colored boathouse, and a great many pigeons drawn as small gray commas along the bottom. The walnut music box sat on the shelf behind the front desk. It had been repaired by a man in Warwick who worked on antique clocks, and he had put it back together with the seams left visible on purpose. 3 fine gold lines running through the wood where the breaks had been, because Elias had asked for it that way. It played all the way through now. It was a little flat in the middle where a tooth had worn down, and there was nothing anybody could do about that. Elias came in on Thursday afternoons. He parked in front, and he walked in through the door, and he did not sit in any car across any street ever again. And on a Thursday in the middle of September, Salvatore Ferraro was at the second table with a napkin flat in front of him, pressing a crease down with his thumbnail, and he looked up when the door opened. He saw the man who came in. He looked at him with courtesy and real attention, and nothing came. Nothing at all. The way nothing had come for 8 years, and the way nothing was ever going to come again. Then he turned around in his chair and found the one person in that room whose name he was certain of, and his whole face opened up, and he said, "Delaney, my son, he is here." The memory did not come back. It never does. But underneath the memory, in the place where a man keeps the things he decided a long time ago about how to treat a stranger who walks in with nobody waiting for him, everything Salvatore Ferraro had ever been was still exactly where he left it, and it never went anywhere at all. That is what a person is worth. Not what they can recall, not what they can still do for you, but the shape they left in the people around them, and the way a room full of strangers chooses to look at them on the days they cannot look back. If this story moved you, please subscribe to our channel and give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And we would truly love to know what you felt while listening, so tell us in the comments, from the heart. Thank you for spending this time with us. We wish you good health, a peaceful mind, and quiet joy in your days. Goodbye for now, and we will see you in the next story.